Hello, friends. Last weekend, I went to my local book festival. This is the Wisconsin Book Festival, and it is presented by the Madison Public Library. And I wanted to share a little bit about the author events I went to and the books I bought and the things I learned. This is an annual event, and this year they had more than 50 author events across 4 days, and I ended up going to 7 author events across 3 days. And I just had a lot of fun opening my eyes to new books and topics that I wasn't familiar with before, and hearing from authors about their work and their craft, and just enjoying a little bit of the local flavor of Madison. The first event I went to was with Amy Yee, who wrote a nonfiction book called Far from the Rooftop of the World: Travels Among Tibetan Refugees on 4 Continents. This is a topic that I have next to no familiarity with, but it was so fascinating to learn about it. Amy Yee is a journalist, and she described that she entered into this topic herself when she was a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times in India in 2008. So at that time, there were lots of protests happening in Tibet around the Olympics, and she covered a press conference with the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala, India. And she talked about being moved by the resilience of the Tibetan refugees who were living there in exile. And in this book, she spotlights their stories over more than a decade as they moved to other parts of India and across continents. And this is absolutely a book that would not have been on my radar outside of it being on the lineup for this festival. But I'm so glad I was able to attend because I got to learn a little bit about the Tibetan community here in Madison as well. Also, on the first day of the festival, I saw Jane Hamilton talk about her new book, The Phoebe Variations. I actually haven't read Jane Hamilton before, but she wrote A Map of the World and The Book of Ruth, which were both Oprah's book club selections in the 90s, and that room was packed. After listening to her speak about this book, I'm not really convinced that this would be my kind of book, but I'm glad I went anyway because I learned that she's a Wisconsin-based author, and I think it's always interesting to hear writers talk about their craft. The book itself is a coming-of-age story about a girl named Phoebe, and her adoptive mother persuades her to meet her birth family, and from what I can tell, it seems like this experience is not a good one, and it sort of turns Phoebe's world upside down. She cuts off her hair and she goes to live with her friends, something along those lines. And something that intrigued me, Jane Hamilton did say at the book event that she was inspired by a performance of Twelfth Night in the idea for this book, or at least the tone of Twelfth Night, which did make me a bit curious. And then on Saturday, I went to several events, and this is really where I ended up purchasing a few books, which, if you know me, you know I don't buy books very often, but I wanted to support these authors and support my local bookstores and get these books signed. So the first event I went to was with Jaquira Diaz, speaking about her new book, This is the Only Kingdom. This is her second book, and her first book, Ordinary Girls, was a memoir around growing up in Puerto Rico. And this book is fiction. And so a lot of the discussion ended up revolving around the differences between writing memoir or narrative nonfiction and writing fiction. And I haven't read this book yet, but it seems to be a family drama and murder mystery set in Puerto Rico. And based on hearing her speak, it seems like it really touches on a lot of issues from poverty to colorism to addiction. And I have high hopes for this book. Next, I listened to Melissa Pebos discuss her latest memoir, The Dry Season, a memoir of pleasure in a year without sex. This event caught my attention because I remembered Cass Krug mentioning this book on her channel, and it intrigued me because I identify as asexual, and I wasn't sure if a book about celibacy written by a person who does experience sexual desire would be at all something that would appeal to me. But listening to the discussion at this event, I got the sense that this is less about celibacy, but it is more about making a major intentional change in the way you live your life and creating a catalyst for doing that. I also get the sense that Phoebos has a relatively intellectual, research-oriented, cultural criticism-oriented style, and I think that is appealing to me more so than simply a manifesto about celibacy. So this is definitely one that feels a little bit out of my comfort zone picking it up in the first place, but the conversation really put me over the edge to pick this one up. Next, I went to an event with Caro de Robertis for the book So Many Stars, an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color. I think that they said they interviewed 30 individuals for this oral history project, and these are multi-hour interviews that are actually available online through Columbia University. I'll make sure I link that website below if you want to check it out. But this book collects transcribed snapshots from those several hundred hours of oral histories that were collected from queer and trans elders of color. And what I found fascinating listening to the way that this book was collected is that rather than simply putting each long-form interview in its own chapter or something like that, De Robertis extracted much smaller quotes from these interviews and organized them into chapters around themes like coming of age, activism, and wisdom for younger generations. I think this approach makes all of these interviews and this collective knowledge much more accessible to the average person, and that was the intention. I think based on the short reading I heard from the event, this could be a very meditative read, either as a window into these experiences or a mirror for your own experiences to comfort you and feel a sense of connection. And then the final event I went to on Saturday, this was sort of the headliner for Saturday and the event that I was the most looking forward to. This was Lily King, who was talking about her latest novel, Heart the Lover. And I must confess that I bought this book last weekend at the event, and I have already finished it and loved it. I was looking forward to this event because I read Euphoria by Lily King back in 2015, and I remember loving that book as well, though I remember very little of the details of how it was written. But that book was historical fiction based on the life of anthropologist Margaret Mead, and the story was based on a real field trip to New Guinea that Margaret Mead and her then husband went on with the man who would become her third husband. And I give that synopsis because Heart the Lover also describes a kind of love triangle, and it is, I believe, a kind of companion novel to her previous novel, Writers and Lovers, which also has a love triangle. I haven't read Writers and Lovers yet, actually, but what I'm gathering is that Lily King has really found her niche in the literary love triangle genre, because while these are books that circle around romance, they are not really romance novels. I certainly think it would be horribly misleading to classify Heart the Lover as a romance book. What I would describe Heart the Lover as is a weepy college and after book. There are 3 parts. The first part shows our unnamed heroine in her senior year of college, where she is a smart but not very ambitious English major. But she is sucked into the orbit of these 2 boys who are very ambitious and intellectual. And then part 2 and part 3 are at different moments in her life after college. I was really glad to get to see Lily King speak about this book and about her writing process in general, and it kind of reignited an interest in Lily King that was kind of buried since I came back to reading in the past few years. So I do feel like I want to go back and read some of her backlist as well, especially since I already read this one and enjoyed it so much. One thing that she mentioned that I thought was pretty interesting is that she said that she always has to go in and add more detail rather than making substantial cuts in the editing process, which I thought was interesting because I am like that with my academic writing and my essay writing, and I feel like that's something I enjoy about her books is that they are a little more sparse and they leave more room for subtext, and I still feel like her characters are fully realized nevertheless. So I just feel like we're on the same wavelength in terms of detail in the writing. The next event I went to was probably my sneaky favorite and a real local treat. This one was with Dexter Patterson, who is one of the co-founders of the BIPOC Birding Club of Wisconsin, and he wrote a guidebook for the birds of the Great Lakes. This event was really meaningful for me because I've recently started going to birding events near me, and the very first one I went to was co-hosted by the Madison chapter of the Feminist Bird Club and the BIPOC Birding Club. And it was such a welcoming place to be new to the hobby. And one of the things that Dexter talked about was his mission to make new birders of all colors and skill levels and ability levels feel welcome. And it was just such a joy to hear his joy about birds and attending to nature. And at the festival, they were actually giving away this book to attendees of the event, but there were so many attendees that I was sitting on the floor, and I put my name on a list to get this book in the mail, so we'll see if that happens. But I think it speaks to the great community building that Dexter Patterson has done, that there was such a good turnout for this event, and it was really wonderful to be there. It was kind of an emotional experience, if I'm being honest. And our public library has a birding backpacks program where you can check out a backpack with binoculars and field guides for adults and for children alike, which is so wonderful. And then finally, the book festival concluded with Mary Roach talking about her latest book, Replaceable You. I have not actually read any Mary Roach books, although I feel like she's quite popular in the space of pop science writing. And her latest book is about the scientific questions and discoveries that enable us to replace body parts, from iron lungs to prosthetics for amputees to stem cell research. It was a joy to hear her talk about her process. She's a very funny person, and I definitely got the feeling that she is a great science communicator because she's humble about confessing the limits of her own knowledge, and because she knows how to circle in on the human aspects that the broader population will find the most interesting. At the same time, I feel like Replaceable You is not a book that's necessarily in my wheelhouse. I feel like I tend to avoid pop science nonfiction because I often feel frustrated by the lack of detail. I think I want more of the research than the average pop science reader. But after seeing her talk about it, this has definitely risen up on my list. And so that was my book festival experience. I'm so grateful to live in a place with such a vibrant literary community and a vibrant public library system. I want to thank you for watching, and I'd love to hear in the comments if you've been to any author events lately or if any of these books sound interesting to you. Until next time, happy reading.